So good afternoon. I love when we have an event and we have a full house. This is wonderful. Not only do we have a full house, we have many of our colleagues in our overflow room downstairs. So it's good. We had an RSVP rate of 250 people. So welcome. It's good to see such a strong interest in this topic. And as you know, we're focusing on water conflict and peace building and development. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, the Director of the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. And as some of you know, or I hope many of you do know, the Environmental Change and Security Program has been very fortunate to have a long-standing, fruitful and dynamic relationship and partnership with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, in particular for the past 3 years. And this report that we're releasing today, Water and Conflict, a Toolkit for Programming, is a product of that partnership. And it's part of our Resources for Peace project. And as you look at the report, one thing that you will see that's noted in the introductory material for the report is that fresh water is irreplaceable and indispensable to life. It's a valuable and contested resource that requires careful, conflict-sensitive management to ensure that it will continue to fulfill its purposes over long term. So we need it. We got to figure out how we manage the conflict dynamics over it in order to ensure its sustainability over time. And there are very concrete and specific approaches to doing so. So this is what we're about today. And I'm really excited as I look at the report, because not only does it identify the key issues and lessons learned, and it looks at the number of program options, I really am excited about the fact that it includes a rapid appraisal guide. So a very concrete and practical dimension to the report. So what I'd like to do is to introduce two of our speakers who will be talking about the report, and then we'll move into a panel discussion and engagement with you around questions to the report. I'd start with a colleague and a friend, Melissa Brown, who's the Director of the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at USAID's Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. Melissa has 20 years of experience with USAID and the Department of State on a wide range of democracy democracy and governance, conflict mitigation, and fragile state initiatives, and most recently has served as the Deputy Director of USAID's Office of Policy in the Bureau of Policy Planning and Learning. And Melissa will provide some introductory remarks, and then we'll go to our colleague Sandra Ruckstuhl, who is a senior specialist at Group W Inc., where she provides technical support, capacity building, and applied research services for aid policy and operations in conflict-affected and fragile situations. For more than 14 years, Sandra has worked with United Nations agencies, the World Bank, and the U.S. government to improve conflict sensitivity of international development and humanitarian aid initiatives in the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. Most recently, she's been working with our team to lead the report to its final conclusions. Yay! We're super excited. She will be sharing with us some of her insights on the report, and afterwards we'll move to a panel discussion. So now I'd like to hand it over to Melissa.
Great. Thank you, Roger Mark, for that kind introduction. And I think that I share your spirit of enthusiasm. Yay, that we've reached this point here today. And what a fantastic turnout. We're grateful for your interest. I'd also like to thank Roger Mark again, Dr. Geoff Dabelko, and Lauren Herzer from the Wilson Center for your excellent partnership and your sustained technical leadership. It's through this partnership that we've developed this toolkit today. We appreciate you hosting as well this important event. We also appreciate your broader efforts to highlight the relevance of both conflict risk and peace building potential across the natural resource management, environment, and development communities. We're here today because of the need to better understand water as it relates to conflict. From the international level to the local level, water management dynamics are often intertwined with environmental realities, as well as complex layers of political, economic, and social decision-making. It is within this context that conflict can be generated or peace built. We seek to better understand those dynamics so that we can most effectively apply development assistance and ensure that safe water is available to sustain human life and natural systems peacefully and sustainably. Today, nearly 800 million people still lack dependable access to clean water. By 2025, projections show that 2/3 of the world's population could be living under conditions of severe water stress. In areas of the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, for example, shifting rainfall patterns is one of those factors disrupting the livelihood of pastoralist groups, leading to increasing conflict over access to water and to land. Given this context, it's not surprising that we at USAID have heard demands from our colleagues working across the globe for tools that support their efforts to foster state-of-the-art technical investments in water that are innovative, conflict-sensitive, and that also build peace. We hope that by producing the Water and Conflict Toolkit, we're responding well to that demand. This particular toolkit is part of a series of toolkits produced by the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation that explores how development assistance can address key risk factors associated with conflict and fragility. The Water and Conflict Toolkit also complements USAID's new water and development strategy, which emphasizes how sustainable use of water is critical to save lives, promote sustainable development, and achieve humanitarian goals. We hope the toolkit will play an important role in supporting conflict-sensitive implementation of this strategy. As I'm sure you will hear from our expert panel today, fair and effective water resource management is a common concern for everyone. It is a shared interest, even in deeply divided communities or regions. As a result, water can be a powerful connector, encouraging cooperation and negotiation in lieu of competition or violence. The toolkit highlights the important role that water-related development interventions can play in building peace. As director of CMM, I congratulate all of those who have been involved in the production of this toolkit. We hope that USAID and our partners find it to be a valuable resource as they work on effective and equitable water resource management, especially in conflict-affected environments. I also want to thank again the Wilson Center and each one of our esteemed panelists who are with us today for contributing their time and lending their expertise to this important topic. Now I want to turn over the conversation to Sandra for her remarks on the toolkit, and again, thank her for her engagement on this product as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. I want to share in everyone's enthusiasm that we've been able to release this toolkit today and share it with everyone here. So what I would like to do in this presentation is, because most of you have probably picked up a copy outside, you may not have had a chance to really go through it. I'm going to walk through the different parts of the toolkit and give a little bit of background of what we intended to do with each of these sections and so forth. So to begin, and is this my, okay. To begin, the complicating issue of writing this toolkit is that the audience is huge, the topic is huge. So whether you are a development practitioner who is building small water infrastructure in a host community in Jordan where there's been an influx of Syrian refugees, or you're trying to build an efficient hydropower facility in South Asia, or you're trying to reunify a water utility in the Balkans after the war, you're all part of the audience that might benefit from this toolkit. So that's our general intention, was to cover an enormous number of issues. Now, what that means is there could be, we couldn't get always as deep as everyone wants to. So as we go through all of this, and as you might have detailed questions afterwards, we'll try to get at that. But I also wanted to point out that this toolkit covers a number of issues on the surface, and we try to reference as many things as possible so that people can drill down and look at things in more detail if they want to, if it's relevant to the work that you are doing in the field. So, for starters, the development goals that we're speaking to in this toolkit is not just about the management of conflict over water, though that is entirely foundational to what we've tried to address in the interventions that we describe and we propose, but it's also, as Melissa referenced, it's about peace-building opportunities through development programs. The purpose of the toolkit is to raise awareness. We are an audience of, I'm trained as a social scientist. We're engineers, we're economists, we are logistics specialists, we're all kinds of things in this audience. So we're trying to raise awareness across disciplines and across areas of work. We're also trying to cover different sectors. Water touches on a variety of sectors. Water management in itself deals with agriculture, energy, water supply, environmental management, and so forth. So we're trying to cut across all of these areas and sectors at different scales. So there are international issues and there are local level issues. We wrote this as with an eye a bit to the conflict assessment framework, the CAF, and how this might be complementary to that. And we're, through this, because we cover so many issues, we're really trying to prompt some creative thinking on these topics. So if we don't cover it, perhaps in this toolkit we've prompted some creative thinking among folks in the field about how we can solve some of these problems that we reference in the toolkit. Now, this is part of a broader collection that I wanted to reference of the CMM toolkits. We used these as a template for the structure of this toolkit. So if you've used these other toolkits, then you would be familiar with the content that we try to cover in here. In the beginning, when we go over the key issues that relate to water and conflict and peace building in these types of situations, under conditions of conflict and fragility. We covered 4 areas of context that are referenced in the CAF. One being socioeconomic and demographic issues, also institutional issues, external influences, and physical and geographic issues. Now, it's hard to compartmentalize all of the problems that we review in the toolkit into each of these areas. They're all overlapping. But what we tried to do is simplify people's thinking about these topics by working with those different categories. So we walk through that. Then also in this section, we had a small box on water and gender issues, which is an absolutely huge topic, but we wanted to touch on the fact that when we think about water and women and water management, we're often talking about the risk of women who are trying to go to a collection point and what kind of violence they might encounter, but this is actually a much broader topic that has to do with food security, health, all sorts of knock-on impacts at the household level, and that this involves a system of men and women, and not only women being targeted as they're going to and from collection points. So we tried to give that a brief review. Lessons learned. We reviewed 6 areas, which could be conceived as areas of good practice for consideration. Considering these issues of water and conflict being transboundary on different levels, from the international to the local level. Considering information management as a primary component in all of the projects we do that try to mitigate conflict and build on peace-building opportunities. Building formal and informal institutions, so it's not just building up things from the line ministry to regulatory institutions and so forth, but it's building capacities at a local level among on a more informal kind of basis. Considering equitable access to water and affordability, considering how different actors, different donors, and implementers in the field should be coordinating, and then also, as we said before, capitalizing on peace-building opportunities, really trying to bring that in and highlighting that as a component of everything that we do. Then we reviewed the do no harm policy, or principles of practice that we often speak to in our work in conflict and fragile situations. Here we tried to review again what those principles are and what they might look like as we put them into action in the water sector or water-related projects. And then here we went through quite some length to illustrate different examples from the field of what interventions can look like in the field. And I won't even try to list through all the different, I think we have maybe 25 different types of examples of interventions, of actual projects, some which we'll speak about here today, of what projects really could look like in the field, who's implementing them where, what are the water management considerations, how does that link to conflict, and how are these projects intervening on those? So that's really, as you can see how the toolkit is structured, we're getting up very highly at the conceptual level, then down to some good principles of practice. In this section, we're getting down to some really detailed stories about what's being done in the field. And a lot of this traces back to what I think of as sort of 4 areas of consideration: roles of water users and managers, relationships between them, the capacity of those, and dialogue between them as well. So that section really gets down to the ground level. Then, as I mentioned before, we tried to cover as many resources as people could want, because even though this toolkit, I think, is 52 pages from cover to cover. We can really only touch on so much in this huge subject. So here's a list of resources, most of them very current resources in the last few years, what other donors have written on the topic, websites and so forth if you want to read more or explore specific areas of the water sector that you're more interested in. And then part 4 is the rapid appraisal guide, which has already come up. So the rapid appraisal guide starts with a kind of broad checklist of considerations for the practitioner to think through what might be the areas that require more investigation, more research and analysis before a project might be designed, or if a project needed to be adjusted while it's in the middle of implementation, or what have you. So that's a quick and easy, relatively quick and easy kind of checklist for the practitioner. And then there's a 2-page list of questions that could be included in a survey document or an interview list of questions or what have you to investigate these things further. So again, none of this can really be cut and pasted into any particular project, but we hope that it could be adapted for different situations and help people build the kinds of tools they need to do the kind of research and analysis to tailor their projects. The toolkit will be available on the CMM website imminently. It also will be available on the Wilson Center website. If you go to the events page for this event, the toolkit PDF will be downloadable there as well, because I think we only have 200 copies today, and if we had 250 RSVPs, we might want to have access to the PDF if you want to share it with anyone. So that's a very quick review of this toolkit, and I know we're going to get down to talking about more specifics and questions people have about operational practice in this field, so I won't get into that on my own. But that's the summary that I wanted to share with you, and I hope this is useful.
Well, thank you very much, Sandy. Thank you, Melissa, Roger, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geoff Dabelko. I have the good fortune of working with Wilson colleagues here as a senior advisor to the Environmental Change and Security Program, and also a professor at Ohio University, the Voinovich School, and somebody who has, from the beginning, worked on this toolkit with colleagues here and colleagues in the room. So I will also share the euphoria at this coming to pass. It has been a long process, but one I think that accurately reflects the complexity of the topic. As Sandy pointed out, it was really hard to decide what was in and what was out in a short document that by definition of its purpose had to leave a lot out, but was meant to raise questions, in some ways be a teaser to get folks connected to deeper resources, whether they be reports and people or cases and experiences. And so that's really the objective of the report and of this discussion, where we have some folks who have broken out of the silos across these topics. I mean, so many times we are challenged by being in the water group or the development group or the natural resources group or the conflict and security group, and that we have too few opportunities to talk, to understand in depth what each other's doing, to find ways to work together, to understand analytically how these issues are connected in the field, and then how do we come back to Washington and this building and find ways to make that work in the bureaucratic silos we have within government, within academic institutions, within NGOs. And so we have some folks who've successfully broken down those barriers, which is really critical to effectively tackling the issues of water, conflict, and peace building. And so we're going to hear from them in terms of their experience and their reflections on what they pulled out of the report. And I've asked them to share, in some ways, their insights and lessons learned, flag ones that appear in here but really resonate with their experiences. So we'll do that with some conversation and questions here among the panel, and then we will turn to you. There are an awful lot of distinguished people with a ton of experience on these issues in the audience, and so we look forward to that dialogue continuing in that form as well, where we can engage you and engage the panel. So to my left is Gidon Bromberg, somebody who, if you're following these issues, well, all these folks, if you're paying attention to these issues, this is a crowd that really doesn't need introduction. But Gidon, as you know, is the Israeli co-director of Friends of the Earth Middle East, a regional organization that recognized, like many don't, unfortunately, but recognized that to tackle the problems that they wanted to tackle, it really required going beyond a single country, and it required an integrated approach. And so, as I think many of you know, in tackling issues of water and sanitation in a area of the world that unfortunately does have a lot of challenges in the conflict realm, they've found tremendously innovative ways to go from the very local up to the international and in between work that has been recognized by Time Magazine and Skoll and a host of other distinguished recognitions for Gidon and his colleagues. And so it's terrific that he can share some of those lessons. Chris Kosnik is acting director of the water team at USAID, someone who has decades of work in the field, heavy emphasis on Africa in the aid context, in the Peace Corps context, someone who has really seen how these issues come together on the ground. And so, but based on that foundation, is able to come back and really lead from within the U.S. government efforts to tackle that in the water sector, a lot of experience in agriculture, a lot of experience in land tenure, and again, these issues that can, if we let them, be treated in isolation, but really come together. So it's terrific that Chris can join us today. You've heard from Sandy. Won't go over her bio again, but Aaron Wolf, another of the kind of friends of the Wilson Center here. It's great to have folks back. Aaron, as I think many of you know, is a professor of geosciences at Oregon State University. He is someone whom we know probably best for his really, I would say, well, transformative sounds so...
No, go with that,
okay.
Go with that.
So, it was a simple insight, right? He actually did the research, or effectively marshaled the graduate students to help him do the research. And he actually figured out, if you look at interactions between two or more states around water and code them from most peaceful to most conflictual, that it's a really much more complex story than our headline writers and our politicians would have us believe. And so from that research, we really broke down the notion that water wars were imminent and everywhere and all around us, and understood it's a much more complex topic, one that fortunately gives us lots more opportunities to practice that peace-building side and that prevention side, rather than just being in complete response and reaction and threat mode. So that transboundary dispute, freshwater dispute database is one that we know him for, but also, like the others on the panel here, all of them have, and Aaron as well, in the room experience playing that negotiator, facilitator role on very local levels, community levels, national levels, and international. And so while it's really valuable to have that top-down 30,000-foot basin level, and I think I haven't asked him today whether he's discovered another transboundary basin, but the numbers go up as Aaron's team finds more transboundary basins in the world. 276, am I up to date?
282, we found a couple.
So I'm behind. So I haven't seen him since December, so I'm behind. So, but also these ground-based perspectives, and so we look forward to having those those part of this discussion. So Gidon, if I could start with you. Friends of the Earth Middle East is actually an NGO that has partnered with and received support from aid to tackle these very issues. If you could tell us about some of your lessons learned and how those resonate with what's found in the toolkit.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jeff. And again, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and USAID CMM program, and of course the authors of the Water and Conflict Toolkit for a fabulous job. And I think the reason why we're so excited about the toolkit is because it's put very much in the forefront the possibilities of peace building. That water is not just conflict. Water is an opportunity in areas where there aren't many opportunities. And I think, to me, that's really the congratulating aspect of this toolkit, is recognizing that, and then being a channel to educate different players, different practitioners in the development sector, of looking for this opportunity. And then, sort of concretely, I think that there's a strong focus here on public awareness, on public education, and how public awareness on the importance of water, be it the transboundary importance when it crosses more than one country, or between the rural and the domestic, or simply between two communities where water, a river or groundwater is shared. We've found in our own experience of Israel, Palestine and Jordan that water is indeed an issue that can bring our communities together, and through the very generous support of USAID through the CMM program, we've been working now for over a decade of partnering communities, Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, that share the same basin of water, be it the Jordan River, for instance, or shared groundwaters of the mountain or coastal aquifer. And public education and awareness plays a critical role, because you literally, in the mindset of conflict, in a situation of conflict, you just can't visit. You can't see the reality of the other. There's danger involved, there's fear, there's prejudice and animosity. So if there is an avenue to come in, and water is one of them, through public awareness activity. So learning about, first and foremost, your own water reality. So we work literally with thousands of school kids, learning about teaching about your water reality. Where does your water come from? What's happening to your sewerage? How are you disposing of your waste, and how that might be impacting your water resources? And doing the same thing next door with the community on the other side, over that political divide. But also asking the question, what's the water reality of the other side? Doing practical activities, we've developed neighbours path trails that identify 4 or 5 stations in each community that speak to answering those questions. Where does my water come from? What's the water reality of the other side? Working with young kids to map environmental hazards a kilometre around their school. And sadly, we have many environmental hazards around our schools and around our communities. And they will identify the coordinates through GPS. They'll photograph the hazards. And then they'll create a geographic information map. So we have a digital map. We bring the two neighbouring communities together, and we put an underlay of the shared water, surface or groundwater. And you literally see the penny drop, because there's suddenly an understanding of interdependence. And it's interdependence of the resource, and by definition, over water, that helps provide the opportunity to work together. Because whatever you do, of course, impacts your community. But whatever your neighbour does also impacts you, and vice versa. So that relationship of interdependence becomes a major factor in supporting cooperation, in advocating working together, not for the benefit of the other. Because in the midst of conflict, you cannot risk being seen as being generous to the other side. You must always identify your own self-interest and stand up to those that condemn you for working with the other side by speaking to your self-interest. But I think what the toolkit has successfully identified in peace dividends and so forth, when you design your programming that speaks to self-interest but mutual gain, then you're really changing mindsets on the ground. And for instance, if some of you have seen the photos of the mayors of the Jordan River jumping into the Jordan River together, as appears in this toolkit, Now, they're jumping into the river together, not because they're best friends. They're not. We're in the midst of conflict. There's heightened animosity. Secretary of State Kerry hasn't completed, and we wish him the very best of luck to complete the effort. But they're jumping into the river together despite the conflict, making a very common, powerful statement that they want to see, they want to demand a different reality. They've come to understand, in fact, that the mayors, be they Palestinian, Jordanian, Israeli, have all become losers because of the conflict, because decisions were taken in Jerusalem, in Amman, perhaps in Damascus for the Jordan River, that took place at their expense. Because if you know the story of the Lower Jordan, you know that the Lower Jordan River has been turned into little more than a sewerage canal. So the mayors are jumping into the river, making a very powerful statement of demanding a different reality. And if we look at the youth level, active residents, the mayors, what we're actually seeing is the creation of political will. And that's another important aspect that this toolkit mentions and draws from, that in the end, it's all about creating political will for change, and water, with a heavy focus on interdependence, is a natural for creating political will for change. I think I'll come back when I have more opportunities.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Gidon. I'm going to go down to the opposite end of the table and, Aaron, ask you to, in some ways, what resonates with you as somebody who's looked from that transboundary regional perspective, but also been down in the room in those negotiations when it can be really at that neighborhood level that Gidon is talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I also want to start by thanking Woodrow Wilson Center and USAID and Sandy for putting this together. It's a really great contribution. I also want to start by echoing in Jeff's very generous introduction. He did mention a truism about academia, that when an academic says, "I did something," he means his grad students did it. And one of my co-authors on that Basins at Risk piece, Shiri Yafi, is here. And the third co-author, Mark Giordano, has just come to D.C., starting to teach at Georgetown. And so he's going to be a great ally, I think, too, in this challenge that we're all facing. I really like the toolkit for a number of reasons, and Gidon mentioned a number of them. And I think what it does is it does best what you described, Jeff, in your introduction, is it tackles different scales in the same document. When we in kind of shared waters, we deal with two basins simultaneously. On the one hand, and you realize as an academic, I'm a huge disadvantage without my 87 PowerPoints and my maps, and talking without a map for a geographer is tough. But if you picture on the one hand, you have a basin the way water people see it, with no political boundaries. The only boundary on a map is the basin itself. So everything in that basin contributes, everything's connected, groundwater, surface water, quality, quantity, all flows to a terminus, and what's stressed in that map are the things that unite us. Gidon mentioned how even in the Jordan Basin, so divided, that's how people come around to seeing the basin. In parallel, there's another basin that's got the way the rest of the world sees the basins, with all the political boundaries on the map. That's what we are. Those political boundaries or sectoral boundaries or ethnic boundaries, they're there for very legitimate reasons. And our challenge now is to manage them both, to recognize that they're both legitimate, and to manage the water as if there were no political boundaries, while recognizing and taking into account all of the legitimate needs, concerns, and aspirations that those boundaries represent. Moses here in the back reminded me of something that I did in The Hague, and I think it's worth doing here. Seeing those two basins is challenged, exacerbated by our training. So just to get a sense, who in the room considers themselves a water person? Somebody trained somehow in water resources. Hands way up high. A lot of the room. Hands down. How many people see themselves seeing the other map? They're more political, IR, political science, management, politics, that world. Hands way up high. Okay, and put them down. How many people see themselves as trained really, really well in both? That's the problem. That's the problem in a nutshell, right? 3 people raised their hand, and this is exactly what the document addressed. This is how do we take on both of these complex worlds and deal with them with the equal legitimacy that both represent. So the parts that I really resonated with me, I've read a lot of stuff on international waters. One, it's practical, it has a rapid assessment. It's filled with a vast library of real-world examples that one can draw from and help in design. The one that I like, and this goes back to the original Basins at Risk work that Shira, Mark, and I did eons ago, there's a focus on institutions. A lot of times we believe that scarcity drives conflict, and one of the things that we found, at least statistically, and then you look in the real world and you find it, believe it or not, actually true, is that scarcity is not the sole driver of conflict. It's not even the primary driver of conflict. What we found in that Basins at Risk study is that if you have a rapid change that exceeds the institutional capacity to absorb the change, that's where you find conflict. And so if you want a great example, Gidon alluded to it. The Jordan ran out of water. Demand hit supply in 1970. That's it. The last shot fired on the Jordan specifically across international boundaries was in 1968. So in all of that time, the basin was totally out of water. You talk about scarcity, that's as scarce as it gets for the last 40-something years. And the entire time, all the growth in economies and population, everything happened in the absence of acute violence, exactly with the examples that are here and that Gidon alluded to. The other thing I like a lot is the connection between formal and traditional. And this is something you see a lot in the field, and those of us in development see it. There's great non-traditional local management going on. Somebody comes in and builds something and comes up with a whole new right system or a whole new market and just wipes out whatever's there. That's a recipe for disaster. And I like that this was alluded to here. And I like this reminder: assess conflict sensitivity even when the goals are sectoral. So even though we consider ourselves water people, there's a lot of stuff going around that water world. The energy world's going around, the demographic world's going around, the resource world's going around. All these things are interconnected. And so even as this focuses on water, the reminder to think beyond. And this is the key. I was so delighted that this jumped off the page, because when I look at conflict and go around the world at basins in conflict, one of the primary conflicts most people don't even acknowledge is the conflict between the donors. And those can be stunning. You think Israelis and Palestinians is tough? Talk about the French and German aid agencies. Good Lord. So this is mentioned and encourage greater collaboration between development partners. I was actually in a meeting on the Okavango where 2 European aid agencies, I won't say who they were not USAID, one turned to the other on the Okavango with a lot of the riparians in the room and said, they started to have an argument about some project, and one said to the other, we'll decide afterwards whose flag flies over this project. And one of the gentlemen from Botswana kind of stood up straight and said, gentlemen, my assumption was that our flag was going to fly over this project. And you see this in a lot of places, in the Mekong and other places. The donors are at the root of some of the most vociferous disputes. And so I was delighted to see that here. And said this, there's still challenges that aren't addressed here. One is disputes between sectors. It is addressed. I don't say it's not. But I think this is key. A lot of times you're in a room, the water sector wants one thing, energy sector wants something else. Defense isn't even in the room. The Foreign Office is too busy to come to this water meeting. This is something also that I think needs to be addressed. And even in the U.S., we talked once upon a time about the 3 Ds, right? Diplomacy, defense, and development, right? This was AID, state, and defense all working together. You don't hear about the 3 Ds very often, but it's the kind of problem that you find around the world. One of the key issues also in conflict is the people who are making individual decisions, even though it may be to the incentive of the group to cooperate, and you can see that it's in their economic incentive or political incentive, the individuals that make the decisions have an individual disincentive to cooperate. And so this is really key. This document is filled with the what needs to be done, the who is often what's missing. The champions that can stand up despite their constituents, despite their political parties, sometimes despite their country's wishes, and say, yes, we are going to cooperate simply because it makes sense, simply because people are suffering and dying, simply because ecosystems are being destroyed. Those are the champions that we look for and the ones that need to be encouraged. And finally, I think the other place that's worth stressing is the collaboration with the private sector is mentioned in here, but also with the spiritual communities around the world. And this is less mentioned. These are our champions also, certainly at the very local scale. If you want to communicate with a local community, often, believe it or not, it's not the American professor from some technical university that's going to make the most powerful case. It's the local imam, it's the local monk, it's the local priest who can most effectively bring the message to the ground. And that's something that I think is being done effectively around the world, and increasingly, and we see it in USAID. I was delighted by the document. I love this challenge that both the document and Gidon and Jeff have reminded us. How do we use this? How do we use water as a language to bring stakeholders into a room and to talk together really about their shared future? Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Aaron. So, Chris, you had some literally decades of work bringing these folks together through the development frame and AID. If you could share your thoughts on how this resonates with your experience and lessons you'd like us to pull out.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. And I would also like to thank Melissa and her office and Mary Ackley, who I have some quotes from. You've always been a very active partner within USAID, and we've worked with you on a range of different endeavors, from implementation of our new water and development strategy to earlier work on land tenure resource rights. And I would also provide a shout out to Cynthia Brady, who unfortunately can't be with us today, and all of her efforts in this. So I think I'd like to start out by framing the relevance of the toolkit for USAID and our new water and development strategy. We finalized our strategy in May of last year, 2013, and in October I transitioned from the Land Tenure Resource Management Office to managing the Water Office and implementation of this strategy. So it's been a wonderful challenge intellectually and otherwise for me, but also a great experience. Within our strategy, it's the first time that USAID ever had a water strategy, and it's the first time we ever put targets down indicating where we'd like to be in the next 5 years. So over the life of this 5-year program, starting in 2014, we hope to ensure that 10 million people have improved access to water, drinking water. 6 million additionally have improved access to sanitation, and another 2 to 3 million that have access to improved agricultural water productivity. So there are two objectives to our strategy. One is water for health, predominantly water, sanitation, hygiene. The other is water for food, which is essentially increasing productivity of water and agricultural systems, both irrigation systems and rain-fed. So a little bit different tack for USAID to, one, frame the key strategic objectives of one of our sector's strategies in terms of several larger initiatives. In looking at this, we wanted to be more selective and target where we would be working. We went through an analysis looking at one sort of quantitative measurement for vulnerability, country by country. So for each country, what is the percentage of access to sanitation, water, hygiene? We also looked at some key health factors that indicated where there were concerns, health concerns related to water. And then we took that vulnerability assessment and we linked it to a qualitative analysis of the capacity of each country to do something strategic and something new in the water sector. So looking at governance systems internally. In doing that, we came out with 38 countries that we wanted to focus on. Or actually, we we originally had been working in about 38 countries around the world. We've winnowed that down to 30 priority countries and trying really to focus in on that. So what's the linkage between USAID's water efforts and conflict? About 90% of our priority countries in water exhibit a significant level of fragility according to AID's 2013 statistics on fragility and risk of instability. Almost 70% of those countries, of our priority countries, are considered conflict affected according to the same index. So you can see that there's no way we could extract water in conflict. In almost all of the countries where we work on water, we have to address conflict issues. So this toolkit is a beautiful tool. Erin mentioned it as a great educational piece, and I see it as that as well. Educating our water specialists a little more about conflict issues and vice versa, but also looking at a whole range of technical sectors within USAID that can learn from this tool and start to identify areas where we can work together and integrate certain technical components. So the toolkit has brought a heightened focus to the connection between water and conflict, by nature bringing staff together. Jeff had asked where development practitioners might apply the toolkit. Obviously, there are plenty of opportunities in different technical sectors. I look to those areas that are particularly complex and challenging, and I look first to our investments in resilience programs in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa. If you look at those efforts, and this was really Dacia that led the charge in trying to integrate our humanitarian assistance and development activities. When you look at the complexity of trying to move populations from relief to economic growth and prosperity, it's a huge challenge. And it requires teams that include technical expertise in climate change, in nutrition, in health, in humanitarian assistance, in water resources management. So I think that some of those programs that are already in action really embody this conflict tool. It hasn't been applied to them yet, but I can see this being used much more frequently in our resilience programs and our water programs moving forward. You also asked about breaking down stovepipes, and here we are. Erin mentioned it. We have the policy wing. We have those that are water experts. We have the handful of people that have a little bit of both knowledge sets that can bring those together. So I just see this as the very beginning of working with CMM and other offices within E3 and within the agency to look at how we really address water and conflict together.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Chris. Gidon, if I can follow up with you and then maybe Sandy as well, and everybody can jump in, but we've talked about some of the things you like in some ways, that the lessons that resonate. But I know from having spoken with you and having heard you speak before that there's some cautionary tales if we don't draw these lessons. So if we just define, just have one indicator of success that ignores these connections, the opportunities that can be lost. From your perspective, are there ones that you'd like to flag and in part to reiterate where we need to focus our attention?
So we've been at this for 20 years, and I think for the first 10 years of our efforts, there'd been a really complete disconnect between the development and the peacebuilding aspects, despite the fact that we're talking about the Middle East conflict. So we saw lots of laying of pipes and they're really important. They were pipes either for water supply or for sanitation, but there was no recognition that the laying of a pipeline can be far more meaningful and far more impactful if relationships are developed between communities that those pipelines serve. And we really witnessed not only lost opportunities, but communities on either side, Israeli, Palestinian, objecting to different development investments taking place because they weren't involved. Because it was seen as, well, we're serving the Palestinian side, and quite rightly, there must be consultation with Palestinian communities. But if there's going to be impacts on the Israeli side, then considering Israel is very powerful militarily in the West Bank, if Israelis are not involved, then that project won't go forward. Or the Israeli neighboring community in Israel proper will try to stop it. So the lack of dialogue, the lack of understanding that you need to be speaking to both sides when laying every pipe. But I think far more important, if you don't understand, if you can't conceptualize that there's a benefit to both sides when, for instance, a sewage treatment plant is built, and that if that sewage treatment plant is built without dialogue with both sides, then you've missed actually an opportunity to help build trust between communities that have very few opportunities to build trust over. So if I take it even further today, we've managed to attract, in the last 5 years, some $400 million worth of investments that we haven't brought the money, but we've leveraged USAID investment, German, World Bank, for these specific projects that speak to the self-interest of the Palestinian side, the Jordanian side, the Israeli side, but also exemplify mutual gain. And in doing that, we empower communities. We build trust between communities. And what we've, I think, really proven on the ground is that once you build trust over one issue, and water is a wonderful issue to build trust over, there's no end to where that trust can lead to. So between two communities, Israeli-Palestinian, that the trust was initially built over water. Today, they've worked together to stop the separation barrier from being built between them, because the notion of enemy moved to neighbor. So we actually have two examples in Wadi Fukin and in Batir. Batir, a Palestinian community on the Green Line, is a fascinating case study, because here we actually managed to split a government. So the Nature and Parks Authority of the government of Israel is objecting to the wall that the Israeli military is trying to build. So the same government now speaks in two voices. And I don't know what will be the end result here. It's before the High Court at this very time. But the whole mindset has completely changed. Everyone is confused. Who's against who here? Who is partnering with whom? So the implications of building trust over water far exceed a water benefit. And I think that's the key aspect of what the toolkit, one of the key aspects that the toolkit has identified. That we have an obligation of all of us that are involved in policy or development to identify the peace dividend of every dollar spent if we're spending in a conflict area.
Sandy?
Is this?
Yep.
That's on, yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Gidon. I have several thoughts that come to mind, but I'll give you three that I'll try to put simply. First of all, when we're measuring, or we're trying to measure our success in these areas, It is extremely complicated to do that. By the way, I didn't mention that in section 3 of the toolkit, there is a section that talks about monitoring and evaluation, and there are a lot of resources listed in there that's certainly worth taking a look at. When it comes to really monitoring and evaluating our success in these initiatives that focus on water, conflict, and peace building, maybe that's the next toolkit we should do, because we don't really have a good template for evaluating these kinds of things. You brought up, for example, building trust and bringing parties together. Now, I find too often we measure success based on engagement. Did the parties come together? Did they talk to each other? Did they come into a room together? We're very simple in this kind of indication of success. That's not an indication of success. What was the quality of engagement? What came out of it? How do we measure trust? How do we measure all of the things that can come out of sustained engagement? It's not just a matter of coming together for one discussion. It's about how that relationship develops over time. So as we look at these systems of water and conflict and peace building, there are maybe 4 big concepts that come to my mind as we're sitting here. I was brainstorming on the paper. First of all, a concept that we talk about a lot in the toolkit is the notion of insecurity being a source, or it could be a trigger, could be a source of grievance. It's a sense of insecurity that stems, or it could be related to water and other things. Access. That's not just access to the physical resource, access to the systems that govern that resource. So we've got insecurity, access, systems of power that dictate our access to these things, our relationships to each other. And 4th is perception, because a lot of this is socially constructed at the end of the day. How do we behave as water users? How do we interact as people who share the resource? How do we govern the resource? A lot of this comes out of our perceptions. And so I think that these 4 concepts are things we need to figure out how to measure better when we're trying to determine our success in these initiatives that attempt to mitigate conflict and build peace through water programming.
Okay. Aaron, can I ask you to jump in on that, and perhaps whether it's how do we measure trust or how do we identify these peace dividends? From your work, I know last time I talked to you, you were flying off to the Mekong and talking to people there. Are there centers of excellence or people getting this right that we can draw inspiration from that kind of overcome some of these problems and challenges that we've identified?
No, not so much. I think people are getting pieces of it right. I think, so the question is, what's a good deal? What's a good deal? And you used to think if there was a deal, it was a good deal. And then our friends at East Anglia, Mark Zaitoon and his school reminded us that a lot of times a deal just basically cements inequities or power imbalance. And a lot of times, particularly in the West or within countries, certainly within the U.S., I think this point that Sandy makes is right, is people are getting together, that's a good deal. Well, yeah, people have been getting together and around the Chad Basin, and somehow the lake's disappearing. And people have been getting together in certain basins around the U.S. and the ecosystems disappearing. So I think if I were to think, we have to come back to the sustainability model and ask that question. I think some people are kind of merging these things, these concepts together. I've seen it. Actually, we had a meeting here on the impacts of dams. If we think in terms of social sustainability, economic sustainability, ecosystem sustainability, and then political sustainability, if we can figure out ways to think about those 4 together, that helps get us where we want to get. And I've only seen it in a couple of places. I've seen it on kind of an integrated assessment of dams, but I don't see it kind of around this larger question of getting around water. More often than not, whoever's sponsoring the process has a vested interest in seeing success. And so success will be named whatever happens to be working, often at the expense of the things that aren't.
Mm-hmm. Chris, you've tackled these stovepipes, as you said. Are there what do you see as critical ways to do it? You're obviously inside and you're trying to make that happen. If you are giving advice to those who are engaging with aid or with the government or other donors, are there pieces of advice that you would tell us for how best to do that and how not, in some ways, how not to reinforce those stovepipes unintentionally? Because it has been terrific in terms of, as we said, talking with the folks at AID with this Resources for Peace project, because it's really easy to be critical from the outside and not understand that, well, it'd be great to work across, but there's this congressional earmark that says no, or it'd be great to do that, but we have a full plate with our own basket, and so quite understandably, you're hesitant to move across the line. So your advice on how we break down these stovepipes would be wonderful.
Well, I have a few thoughts. You mentioned some of the additional challenge that AID has in terms of the directive language that we have to follow for different earmarks. That I don't think that's relevant outside of USAID, so I won't get into that. Having been involved in quite a number of efforts to integrate different technical components, some successful, some not, I think it's very important that we start from the local context, and that is the local governance context, the natural resource space, before we start thinking about, well, what do we bring together? What technical sectors or expertise do we bring together in one place? So I think one of the things that this toolkit may help us do is to be a little bit more thoughtful and to have some guiding questions that point us in a common direction wherever we're working within USAID to identify what are some of the priority issues. And you rarely can bring together a large enough investment to solve the whole problem. So what are the key components that set you on that path, which we all know is, if we're talking about changes in governance, particularly community level institutions, municipal level institutions, that's a 15, 20 year process to build the internal local capacity to manage things themselves. So integration is great. I think this is a great tool to help us do that a little more artfully than we've done in the past at times.
Great. Nice. Thank you, Chris. Well, as I mentioned, we have a lot of expertise in the room that's not sitting on the stage. It's out there with all of you. And what we'd like to do then is gather up some questions, and we can divide and conquer up here on the panel, maybe take a couple at a time. Colleagues have a microphone, and we ask that you wait before posing your questions so that the folks watching the webcast and viewing the webcast archived later on the Wilson Center website will have the benefit of hearing your question. We do want questions rather than speeches, and as tempting as it is to give a speech about these topics. And so we'll gather a few, and then, like I said, we'll try to tackle them the best we can. So I will attempt to keep a list. We can start with the gentleman down here, and then just give me a wave and we'll get it on a list here.
Good afternoon. Is this on?
Yep.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your service and support and your points to consider or clarify. I'm Dr. Whidden. I did the reconstruction planning for Kuwait and also for Mogadishu. And I planned that there'd be no water in either city when I got there and stood up the original CMOGs. So I had to request the desalinization plants, the water trucks for 500,000 people in each one of those cities. Tremendous operation. Water is a vital, basic asset, as you've pointed out. You have to consider that at the very root of anything that you do in the Middle East. Please comment on why we did not discuss those two cities in your report. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll defend them right off the bat. We had the whole darn world to tackle on this, so we definitely, there are some cities that are left out. Down, if you can come over here, down front, we'll get
Tim Resch, USAID Africa Bureau. Aaron made a reference to scale, and so I kind of wanted to ask Sandra about the kind of the most basic scale of kind of at the well point, at the water user group level. It's much. You have to really stretch the name of Peacebuilding, but to that aspect of dealing with water and conflict is frequently within the community. Who's got the access? The pastoralists, the small scale agriculturalists, the household water users, and so it's a different set of tools or a subset of tools in the toolbox. So I wanted to ask about that.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Yep, have right back up here on the right-hand side, about halfway up. And again, just wave a hand and I'll try to take a list. Okay.
Before I go on a trip, one of the
Yep, it's on. You're
first things that I do is check how much gas I have in the tank. So many of these water systems in the world are non-renewable. They've got a certain amount of gas in the tank. So if you're going to start managing those waters, you need a way to manage the data. You need to understand the resource and how it's being used. So in the toolkit, if this is going to be a management toolkit, or at least help management, how do you handle this process of getting the data that will allow you to manage?
Okay, so we'll take those and then we'll start next in the middle right there. If we can get the microphone to the lady in the middle in the brown. Aaron, why don't we throw you the data question to start?
Well, sure. So the first thing is it's actually front and center in the document. I read it pretty carefully, and data is all over this place, and not only data. And I want to also mention the strength of the document, pointing to the other two questions. This isn't a document about water scarcity. This isn't a document even about water management. This is a document about water and conflict, and those are really, really different things. We can have vast discussions about managing water. The challenge is when you're managing water, there are political ramifications and political implications, and it's that second set of questions that's front and center in this document, and front and center here. So everything else, important though it is not the point here. It's the relationship between water management and political conflict. That's the intersection. And so in data, I would absolutely agree. You got to know what's there. Now, then I would come back to Gidon and say, okay, if we're going to go out and gauge a well, why don't we do it cooperatively so we can understand what's there together? Now you're starting to use the data or the management access to help use water as a peace building. And having read through this document, it's front and center in here, using technical questions to support dialogue, using modeling and data as a basis for understanding the boundary conditions of the dialogue is throughout here. So I'd actually point to that as a strength of the document rather than something that's missing.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that, because conflict often hides the inequality. The broader conflict becomes an excuse not to deal with the inequalities in place. So it's very easy in a state of conflict simply to blame the other side and not have to ask the more difficult questions of, well, am I managing my water resources as a given water authority in the most efficient and sustainable way? And lots of examples. We have been working in a Palestinian village called Uja for 15 years. Uja had water once a week supplied to the homes. That's very prevalent throughout Palestine, also in Jordan. And when we started working there, the mayor said to us, help us get the permit. It's the Israelis that are not giving us the permit to redo the water network. So we went to the Israeli Water Authority, asked them, well, why? Why aren't you giving? And they said to us, well, we've never had a request. And so we went to the Palestinian Water Authority and asked them, well, what's happened here? And well, we learnt that quite legitimately, Uja wasn't the top of the list. They had other legitimate concerns, legitimate needs to improve water supply. But the easy response to tell the mayor of Uja was, it's the conflict. And therefore, there's no further questions asked. So as soon as we delved a little bit, of course, the mayor came back to the head of the water authority, and guess what? Uja has 24/7 water. It has a better water supply than Ramallah today, and I must say USAID funded the water network that replaced. So conflict often hides transparency, avoids accountability, and as Aaron quite rightly mentioned, by undertaking common fact finding, we can truly build a better basis for understanding. Because when we're out in the field together, another example of the Jordan River, where Israel is responsible for half of the demise of the river. Half of the water is taken by one country, but the other half is taken by the other two, in this case Syria and Jordan. But unless all sides understand that they have responsibility, so you can blame the Israeli side, but it's much better if you call all sides to be accountable. Then you're creating a very different discussion, because you can indeed call on one side to be returning a fair share of that 50%. But you broaden that discussion, and what's your responsibility for the other 50%? So that once you've undertaken common fact finding, and I must say, within our own office, our Jordanian staff would not believe that Jordan was responsible for 25% of the demise. And until we had our Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli water hydrologists out there and study the issue, were they convinced? And of course, it's much more powerful when a Jordanian speaks to a Jordanian, a Palestinian to a Palestinian, an Israeli to an Israeli, based on a common fact-finding effort. And I think that's the importance of the data collection when we're dealing with conflict management and peace-building efforts.
We'll start right there, and then I see Carl and a hand back there, and then we'll come down here. Oh, great.
Hi, my name is Ilona Coyle with the Environmental Law Institute, and I was wondering, do you have any good examples of developing linkages between national and formal institutions and local level governance, and where that's worked well to build peace around water issues?
Okay, great question across scales. Terrific. Carl's right there, so why don't we hand it to him, right? Yep.
Hi, Carl Brook from the Environmental Law Institute. In a number of countries, we see local level conflict over natural resources that does not escalate. And I'm wondering, what is it that, what are the mechanisms or what are the reasons that these local conflicts generally do not escalate to national level conflict? Is it that, these are ultimately over local resources, or is it some sort of governance mechanisms that step in? What is it that prevents local conflicts from escalating?
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Carl. And gentleman back there.
Hi, my name is Ron Robinson. I'm with USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. Thank you very much for the toolkit. I'm very excited to see it. During your presentations, I've heard a lot of talk about building trust, bringing partners together, inclusion of spiritual communities, participation of youth, addressing perceptions of self and other, and gender participation. This to me sounds like it would be a great tool or an instrument in countering violent extremism. I wish that you could comment on that, please.
Okay, and then we had one more down here in the middle, and then we'll take another round and then come back, Kirby, after that.
Thank you very much for your presentations. They were excellent. My name is Amanda Mayoral. I work at the U.S. Institute of Peace on the Water Security and Conflict Prevention program there. My question is for Gidon. You mentioned that creating political will was key. Could you describe how or what your experiences have been in doing that, and what are effective ways for creating political will?
Okay, terrific. 4 good questions. Thank you very much. I promised we'd divide and conquer. Chris and Sandy, do you want to have your pick of the litter to start, and then we'll give these guys the tough ones?
Great. These are some tough ones. I'm going to start out with Carl's, and I don't know that I actually have an answer for it, but why do local conflicts not escalate to a national scale? And just looking at experience from natural resources management side, my assumption there would be that those local conflicts, they are real conflicts, they appear as conflicts, but there are customary practices for resolving some of those issues. When AID, for example, looks at land tenure property rights in conflict over those resource rights, often what we try to do that has been very different than most of the other donors, instead of trying to force a francophone or an English legal system on a traditional culture, we look at and identify what are the components of the customary practice that are working, and how can we bring statutory law in line with that customary practice. And that very often is a way to alleviate conflict.
Okay, Sandy?
Sure. You actually just brought up exactly one of the things I was going to mention. So I'll move directly onto another thing. These are sort of interconnected, some of these questions about local issues, and I should answer your question about the water users associations as well. So the local conflict escalating and a question of violent extremism as well, which is all related. If we think about the Arab Spring uprisings, for example, some people have referenced drought and food prices and what's happened to the food markets in the Middle East and North Africa as being one of the reasons why people came to the streets to voice their grievances. So if we're thinking about what prevents local conflicts from escalating, I'd like to rewind and say, how does water play into the socioeconomic system to breed stability or instability, maybe? And so if we think about if access to water is affected, and therefore it can have all sorts of impacts on how people are relating to their government and the government services, how people are relating to each other, if they're sharing the well, the pipe, what have you. So if we think about that issue of how water connects and divides us, it goes back to this whole thing about social construction and perception of access and systems of power. So anyway, the other question I wanted to mention about the water users associations, because I think this is very actually important. If you look at the program options section, we reference or we detailed a couple different projects that get down to that level to give a couple examples of how local water management and these institutions could help mitigate conflict between water users. I also think that we try to make everything in the toolkit scalable. From the national to the local level or international to the local level, but also the rapid appraisal guide is intended to be scalable. So if you look at the questions, really you could be asking this of national authorities, or you could be asking these questions of local water users. So hopefully you'll find some of that transferable to help investigate those issues. But then that brings us back to the issue of traditional methods of conflict resolution and informal methods of resolving disputes and things like that, where we're not dealing with the government authorities necessarily. So this is another issue of that I just wanted to come back to what Chris was saying. This is really foundational to preventing local conflict from escalating and a serious consideration in the design of all of our programs. So,
thank you, Sandy. Aaron, maybe the first question about national and local level connections, and then we'll have Gidon talk about political will.
Sure. Simple answer is I don't know. First of all, I want to commend Carl and the work of the Environmental Law Institute, who's done a lot of these investigations around the world and actually crafted a lot of these. So I suspect part of your question is rhetorical. I suspect, documentation. So the two sides of this local to international scale that came up from the two ELI folks, one is are there good cases of where it works, where the local processes or allocations actually scale up? And I know more about it on in projects, big projects. I know that donors are getting better and better about asking what's there before superimposing a new process. On the conflict resolution side, that's actually something I've been looking at a bit, and there are a lot of places where national government will respect what's local at the local scale, and that's true in Morocco, and it's true in Laos. And so in these kind of local scales, village scale or a countryside scale, what's there and what's working is left alone to continue working. And then at the national level, there's another system that works, which primarily a Western legal system, that's profoundly different. It's less community-oriented, less collaborative, more right and wrong, more legalistic in our own frame of thinking. And so these two systems work at their two scales. The problem is increasingly problems are in between those two scales. And that's precisely where you get this disconnect between the local community collaborative approach and the big legalistic judicial approach. And that's precisely the problem. I haven't seen in a lot of places where that's been bridged effectively. And if you do, I'd really throw it back, Carl, because we can all use the help. The why don't local problems escalate, that's something also I only have the thoughts and experience that I have, but one of the primary misconceptions about water is that you can go across the border and get it and bring it back. And the bottom line is you can't. Here's a cubic meter of water, which weighs a metric ton, okay? So if you think about how much energy it takes to go across the border, get somebody else's water and bring it back, it's way more cost effective to desalinate or to dig deeper or to treat it or to move it from agriculture or to do 1,000 different things than go across the border, get it and bring it back. And the other disincentive for going across the border is that the level of decision making moves up as you increase in scale. So a farmer will shoot at another farmer, no problem. Some parts of in the western U.S., happily, almost. They'll shoot at each other. But then when you start to talk about going across the border, even to Canada, and we love Canada, right? That level of decision making is so high, and those sets of incentives and disincentives are so off that it's almost never at the national incentive to make the decision to go across the border, really because you can't do anything once you're there.
Okay, get on. The political will?
So we've found that leaders don't lead. Leaders tend to follow. They tend to be conservative, they're scared, risk takers. They're not risk takers. And therefore, if we want to see the status quo, then you don't do anything. If you want to see change, then you need to encourage leaders to start acting differently, to taking different decisions. And that's why creating political will is so crucial if you're wanting to see conflict resolution take place. And focusing on water as a means of creating political will, from our experience, has proven to be very, very productive. Because we've often found that if we start at the community level, mayors are very reluctant to meet the mayors of the other side, the enemy. But if all of their school kids are learning about their water reality and their neighbor's water reality, and they're meeting about it, and they're talking about cross-border interdependencies, and their parents are signing forms that are allowing their kids to meet the so-called enemy, then mayors start to think, oh, well, maybe this is not so risky. And a political step is taken, and the two mayors meet together. And then when the mayors jump into a river together, and they make CNN and BBC, and of course, most importantly, our own media, Palestinian, Jordanian, Israeli, well then, some members of parliament are thinking, oh, okay, maybe this is not so risky after all, and we too can take on what is the rightful thing to do and change the way that we manage water resources and start working with the other side in doing so. So creating political will is absolutely crucial. We have found that it works best from the bottom up, because the higher you go, the more risk averse politicians are, and the more you build a constituency to take those risks, to take on these issues, the higher you can work up the ladder and see real change taking place. So, an example of how local is impacting national, well, we're 20 years in this business, and we have some really good examples. So, Israel and Jordan, 20 years ago, signed a peace treaty. One of the chapters of the peace treaty was to rehabilitate the lower Jordan River. Surprise, surprise, for 20 years there was no political will to implement that aspect of the treaty. Well, in the last year, a joint working committee between the two governments has been established specifically for the rehabilitation of the Jordan. That didn't happen by accident. That happened by design. And the people that created that political will were the kids in the schools, because they were first, and the leaders followed them, not vice versa. So creating political will does create actual change on the ground. And guess what? For the first time in 49 years, fresh water started to be released down the River Jordan. I had a mayor from both sides, a water minister from both sides come and say, you guys, you environmentalists, you dreamers, you tree huggers, water is too scarce. We're not going to waste water to allow it to flow down the River Jordan. We're not going to allow water to go beyond our borders and empower the other side, the enemy. Well, that was said to us a decade ago. Today, that same leadership is carrying the flag of rehabilitating the Jordan River. That this is their project, this is their political leadership, this is their success. And that's wonderful, because that's what peacemaking is all about. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the community. It's for the leaders to grab that flag, be it with great hesitation. But in the end, if they grab that flag of change in mindset, of improvement of livelihoods on the ground, then we see improvement of livelihood on the ground and real opportunities emerging from that.
Thank you, Gidon. We had a question from Kirby Riling down here, one of our key partners at CMM Aid in producing this document.
Yeah, hi, Kirby Riling, Office of Conflict Management Mitigation. Sandy, in your introduction to the toolkit, you mentioned the page on gender and water and conflict, and how there's a lot to be said there, and a lot of nuance that could be injected into some of the stories one often hears. So I was hoping you could maybe say a few more words about that topic, and then invite other members of the panel too if they have reflections on gender, sort of the women, peace, and security angle.
Okay, thank you, Kirby. If you could give David the microphone, and while you're doing that, I'll read a question that came from our folks downstairs in the overflow room. It's for Aaron, asking if you could speak to the concept of benefit sharing and how you see that kind of method and conceptualization of these issues playing out, particularly at the local level in the context of peace building. So, David Mickle.
Hi, David Meckel, Director of the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center. Many of the questions and responses have circled around issues of scalability and integration, and the conflict toolkit is directed to a wide range of audiences in development agencies, political institutions, but also in the conflict-afflicted countries where these projects and interventions will take place. And if we start with the example of the rapid assessment or some of the checklists that are provided in the toolkit, these checklists place significant demands on the operating institutions for a degree of coherent, holistic, to coin a phrase, integrated water resources management. And my question is, how integrated and holistic do the target conflict-afflicted countries have to be to assimilate these policy projects? Almost by definition, institutions are often feeble, weak, conflicted within these countries, and yet we would like to build their capacities to undertake integrated, holistic projects. And we've heard here the questions about, how can we scale up from the national level? Aaron has alluded to sometimes the disjunction between functioning local institutions that adopt one manner of thinking or approach versus national level institutions that adopt another. And I would postulate, and don't let me answer my own question, but I would postulate that these disjunctions aren't bugs, they're features. That Aaron, as the geographer, had put before us two maps, one of the river basin, one the political map. But because, as we've all mentioned, water is also associated with energy development, food production, transportation. The energy grid on that river basin doesn't correspond to the political map or the water basin map. The food production map, the imports and the exports of materials, don't correspond to the river basin either. The transportation grid doesn't correspond to the river basin or the political map, and yet all of these are stakeholders. So those silos, the Ministry of Power, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Water, they're divided that way for pre-existing reasons, and as we ask people to leap across those borders and leap out of them, we're reformulating a universe of consistency, coherency on the one hand, but perhaps also chaos on the other. So how integrated do we need to be in order to conduct integrated water resources management?
Thank you, David. And I should say thank you not just for your question, but also as one of the early reviewers that really made this a much better product in terms of giving us high quality feedback. Ken Conca from American Universities here played the same role, and I'm sure I'm missing some others. We had an excellent set of external reviewers multiple times give us good feedback. So we got a couple good ones and not necessarily easy ones. But Sandy, do you want to start with Kirby's on gender?
Sure. Thank you for your question, Kirby. There's so much that could be said about this topic. I want to highlight a couple things that we referenced here, and certainly, the challenge is this isn't just about women. This is about men and women and how they relate to each other and how they have different priorities in the household, different priorities in terms of how they participate in the economy and in society. So when we're looking at gender and water, we all too often assume women and water. We're not looking at how men are participating in these systems. So first of all, if we take conflict and peace building out of it, we need to consider how different users, including whether, what gender they are, and beyond that, what age they are, okay? So women and girls are going to be behaving differently with the water resources as men and boys will be. So we need to really, when we're doing any kind of analysis of how water users are behaving, we need to disaggregate to that level to really consider gender dynamics more effectively. Unfortunately, and if I'm wrong, I want somebody to please grab the microphone and tell us all where this resource might be, because I can't find a good resource that talks about men women and water. If there's any technical guidance in that area, we all should know about it. So, but then beyond that, when we're thinking about gender and water and what the risks are for men and women and boys and girls in trying to use safe water and access safe water, we also need to consider that there are socioeconomic considerations, that a poor household is going to be more vulnerable than a wealthier household. So we often, again, we go back to this paradigm of women and water, and we're not thinking about a woman in a more well-off household is not going to be at risk in the same kind of way. So if we are going to tailor our interventions that are going to try to reduce vulnerability, reduce the risk of violence, and reduce the negative effects on other residents in the household, we really need to break down our analysis far better and not just think about women as one homogenous group in all countries around the world. So yeah, those are some of my initial thoughts on what needs to be further considered.
Aaron, how about sharing benefits?
Yeah, well, I'll actually do two because I think they're related. I think David's comments on kind of the problem shed, which is a term that gets used for the larger issue of all the issues that cross borders, and the concept of benefit sharing kind of go hand in hand. So benefit sharing, for those who haven't heard the term, if you're only allocating water, you get stuck because the quantity of water is a zero-sum game. So one of the approaches advocated in recent years is think about the benefits that water brings, and that allows you to grow the pie, if you will. So between the U.S. and Canada, for example, we have an agreement on the Columbia Basin where we basically thought about two sets of benefits. We thought about hydropower development, flood control. And if you do that, you can actually quantify the benefits, and you're not stuck trying to allocate water. You can think, oh, so much benefit of flood control, so much of hydropower. And now not only do we have a way of growing the basket of benefits and seeing how development of water resources benefits both sides, but you also have a way to allocate the benefits. And so that's what we do. We basically quantified those two benefits, split the difference, and we wrote a check to Canada for the difference because the benefits accrue downstream. And in a lot of parts of the world, this is now what's being done. So in places, the Nile's probably the classic, where the World Bank and AID and a number of other folks have helped think about, if you thought about the benefits around the Nile, can you get around the fact that some countries are absolutely fixated on the amount of water crossing their border? And so now you start to think, if you develop collaboratively, you've now got 11 countries, if you develop collaboratively, what could you do in terms of hydropower? What could you do in terms of infrastructure, road networks, trade, agriculture, all these kinds of things? Think collaboratively. Now the benefits grow, and you have a way to come to an agreement where an agreement is in everybody's benefit. If you're stuck on allocating water, it's zero sum. One party's gain is another party's loss. Which then goes, I think, to David's point about how integrated do you actually need to be. And the bottom line is not very much. At the minimum, two countries need to agree on three things about the water crossing their border. They have to agree on the quantity, the quality, and the timing. And that's it. Beyond that, you can basically say country A will do everything within its own sovereignty, with its own people, with its own constituency, to make sure that it delivers quality, quantity, and timing. And country B will do everything within its. You don't have to integrate anything except for those three things. And that's, again, what we've done with the Columbia. We don't have the Columbia River Agreement. We don't have a basin organization. We have a very detailed agreement as to what's going to cross the border and when. Now, having said that, that agreement embeds a whole list of values that get ignored. That agreement with Canada was signed in 1964, and we ignored tribal rights, we ignored fisheries. So even though we have this great agreement that works, now we're in a place where we're trying to renegotiate aspects of the agreement, and we have to, in those three things, quality, quantity, timing, embed these values that have grown up. Who gets the say over how much water? Should it be for fish? Should it be for hydropower? Should it be for something else? That's where, at the minimum, you need very, very few agreements, and if you're actually having a realistic conversation, that's where you have to integrate to some level. And that's, again, a balance. I don't think there's a formula, but it's a balance.
And I think the situation has become so much more complicated because of issues like climate change, where the reliability of water resources changes so dramatically. So agreements that were built around quantities, one side sharing X amount and the other a different amount, will make very little sense today. So it's another example where you've reached an agreement, but is that agreement actually going to lead to more conflict down the road? Because the reality of what's available is completely different today than what it was a decade ago. Or that needs, populations have changed dramatically, yet the agreements don't take into consideration needs, varying technologies that have developed, particularly in the last 5 years, wastewater reuse and desalination. And of course, we need to stop looking at water just as a pie to be divided between two peoples. There's a third party there, and it's called nature. And we all are dependent on that third party. And if we just treat water as a pie to be divided, then we're going to lead to conflict, because nature doesn't respect that pie that we've artificially drawn. So indeed, the capacity issues, the amount of thought that needs to be invested in striking more modern water agreements that go beyond the pie, that speak to sustainability, that speak to efficiency. Because is it right that we can be so wasteful of water resources? We speak of water consumption of 300 litres per person per day in the Middle East, maybe 100 in other parts of the Middle East, while other parts of the world, and the United States is perhaps the worst example of it, will consume 1,000 litres. So efficiency, sustainability must be introduced into how we manage our water resources and how we discuss managing water resources in the context of sharing, conflict, cross-border, cross-sector.
Terrific. We've just about run out of time for this part of the discussion. As you can see, it's a rich set of complex and diverse topics. One that, to put this together, literally did have many hands working together and across these different areas. I do want to make sure to flag some folks who aren't up here but very easily could and were absolutely instrumental. And these are primarily our partners at AID. Cynthia Brady, who Chris rightly mentioned, is unfortunately can't be with us today, but critical to this effort. Joe Hewitt, who is, Kirby Riling, who is, Mary Ackley, who is, and Melissa was here, Lauren Herzer and my colleagues here at the Wilson Center, of course. And then, as I said, a number of external reviewers whom we've been in dialogue with and has helped Sandy and me and a whole bunch of folks who've been working on this going back some years. And it's been really a group effort. One that, as folks have said, we want to have be used to start conversations, to start connecting across these silos in terms of their topics, in terms of the sectors, within AID, outside of AID with its partners and the folks who are tackling these issues, whether they're an NGO, whether they're an academic, whether they're doing monitoring and evaluation in partnership with international organizations. And it really is all these folks who have to find ways to work together and across these lines, which is really the intent of this modest effort to bring this complex stuff together. So I thank all of you for helping walk us through the meaningful lessons learn from your perspective in this. And I thank all of you for coming and sharing your insight. And we hope that you will make sure all the copies are gone out front and that you will take advantage of them being available, the report being available on AID's website and the Wilson Center website to share this with your colleagues as well. So please join me in thanking our colleagues here today.
Nice job. So it's out. And congratulations.
Now,
Yeah.